Hello and welcome to another edition of TechLaunch in the News. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to this edition of Security and Performance in the News. In this particular edition, we're going to be taking a look specifically a lot at security. And to start with, we're going to take a look at the NIST special publication that talks about the Secure Software Development Framework. Now, this is recently published, really interesting if you're into security and just kind of looking at some of the latest frameworks, as they're typically called, and what you can do to kind of adhere to them. Now, one of the interesting things about this is coming from the government, and generally it will include a lot of credibility and add a lot of credibility to whatever kind of security stance you're currently taking or working to take within your organization. Now, if you're a leader and you're trying to kind of determine, what level of security stance you may want to take, the reality is there's no great answer. A lot of times it truly is a gray area that is relative and it's on a spectrum. But this can be at least a helpful guide to give you kind of key focus areas or prioritization around what may be the best investment for the most output from that investment. Now, one of the interesting things that this kind of goes into is that basically it's talking about kind of ramping up your organization and getting your organization ready for what is a pretty intensive process that requires commitment in the long term. Now, why is that? Well, basically, you've got to be able to get all of the different endpoints and all of the different potential kind of vectors of attack. And that's the reality of software today. Is there are a lot of vulnerabilities. There are literally thousands and thousands of different kind of vectors of attack that can work, and it only takes one in order for a bad actor to get results that they want. One of the other things is being able to kind of document and follow processes internally to have rigor about how you're implementing patches and updates to security, these kind of things. Now, this actual document, it goes into it. It has the executive summary and it kind of goes into a detailed framework. But then as you kind of get into it, what you'll see is they actually have detailed practices, tasks, implementation examples, and then detailed supporting references. And it's pretty well organized too. So you can see this is kind of like a game plan or a punch list for how you can set up your secure kind of framework that you can operate from. Now, one of the things that this doesn't do is it doesn't actually complete a process for you or with you. There are some really amazing software platforms, some of which are free and open source, some of which are paid, which will do some of this analysis for you on your current stance. And it can interact with your team and help automate the process with your team. But ultimately, the main point that we want you to kind of get from this is a relatively recent update, and we encourage you to take a look at it if you haven't already, along with the other supporting resources. A lot of folks look specifically at industry, kind of non-government based resources, and the government has some incredible resources and incredible documentation around security that really are worth digging into. Okay, with that said, let's take a look at the next article. Okay, so this next article is talking about how organizations lag on confidence and policies to manage open source security. And this is pretty interesting because you're seeing a lot of this coming out now recently around how things like the log4j example, if you're not familiar, there was a pretty major vulnerability in Java due to this log4j kind of open source logging mechanism. And if that was something that you had in any of your software with so many dependencies on Java, there were literally, you could say, billions of situations where people were vulnerable from this, then you were exposed to this vulnerability. And for a period of time, and this is still true today, there are unpatched kind of endpoints and open vectors that people could attack because of this open source log4j system being part of a bigger framework, and that bigger framework being used by other systems. And you can see how there's this kind of concept that you almost have this open source supply chain, as it's typically referred to as, where you have a lot of open source software that a lot of people trust, and they just intrinsically use that software, well, this ubiquity of this open source software has made it a target. And attackers have realized that the open source supply chain is typically going to be easier to exploit than directly looking for vulnerabilities in end user application. So definitely a challenge, because then what this means, and you can see from this study, is that 2/3 of the respondents to this study estimated that their organizations had been breached at least once in the previous 12 months. 2/3 estimated in the last 12 months they've been breached. Now, the reality is probably more true for more of them than, maybe folks would care to admit. And the challenge with this is a lot of this open source software is really fundamental and kind of foundational to being able to deliver so much value at such a low cost. And one of the interesting things that this goes on to kind of talk about is the increased threats of malicious code injection as part of the supply chain attacks makes it critical to protect open source software dependencies. And this is pretty interesting because the open source software dependencies are kind of, again, a foundational aspect of what got a lot of software to where it is and helps it get there quickly. Doesn't mean that we can't keep doing that, but there has to be more of a cynical eye, or at least a watchful and kind of trust but verify type of approach with that open source software. Okay, let's take a look at the next article now. Okay, so this article talks about how the Center for Internet Security partnered with Aqua Security, and they basically made a supply chain security guide that you can download. And this is kind of getting into this concept of the software supply chain, not a physical supply chain, as it were. The software supply chain guideline can break down basically into these 5 key areas: source code, build pipelines, dependencies, artifacts, and deployment. Now, if you're focusing on security and you're looking at software development in general, this is a great primer and a great resource for you to have as a reference whenever you're executing on security or secure projects in general. One of the things that's pretty interesting from this kind of overall article is that they say that research shows that 95% of IT leaders say that Log4j or Log4Shell was a wake-up call for cloud security, and that with 87% of them admitting they feel less confident about their cloud security today than they did prior to that incident. So that is a substantial amount of people who are concerned about security, and they should be. And this is kind of, again, this partnership between these two companies, in particular the nonprofit CIS, it really helps to give some concept of where to inspect and where to look for that security. So basically, the kind of takeaway here is that it's really not possible nowadays to trust intrinsically the open source supply chain for software, and that's just kind of the reality going forward. Okay, let's take a look at this next article. Okay, so this article is pretty interesting because it's an interview, and it's an interview with the Sync founder, Guy Podjarny, and he basically is talking with one of the McKinsey folks and just going into a lot of detail around the actual kind of entrepreneurial spirit and entrepreneurial side of things, managing and executing on the business, but also kind of what got it started. And so he really gets into the weeds around security and how that should really start with development. And we think that's really interesting because absolutely, when you get down to it, the development folks, they are creating vulnerabilities if they're not designing with security in mind. And it really should start with development and kind of even further up the pipeline with business owners really thinking about this security from day one. One of the interesting things that he talks about is how he believes that the DevOps industry cannot continue with security going against the grain of the business. So in order to get it to work well, it really has to be developers who embrace it. And I would even argue the business folks themselves need to embrace it and make it part of their mantra so that it's more of a cultural thing whenever you're operating as a secure software company. and you have a part of your company that you're kind of completing software development, you really need to have that as part of your kind of fundamental operating mechanism. And I think nowadays, with enough kind of negative press and negative results, that's just a fundamental part of what's going to continue to happen. This idea that he kind of hits on is basically that he's been able to take Sync, this company that he created with co-founders, and basically make it like a development tool and make it really something that developers adopt. So you kind of see that theme throughout. That would be something that we would point to as a key takeaway just in general, as being in the security space, is that essentially one of the big things that you want to do is you want to literally focus on making any kind of security and performance arenas, kind of get them established within the business itself, really look at what the pain is and what the cost is from not doing that, and help to build it into the culture of any company that you're a part of or that you're helping to influence. So that does it for this edition of Security and Performance in the News. Thanks for watching this edition of TechLaunch in the News. If you haven't already, feel free to subscribe so you can see more in the news resources. We also have complimentary masterclasses and other resources available to you on our website, www.gotechlaunch.com. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them in the comments section. And until next time, thanks for watching and bye for now.